Senator from Ohio, Jim Renacci.
Thank you all for being here. I first want to thank some individuals that are here. Senator or State Rep Bill Seitz, I know, is here. Thank you for being here. Josh Gert, Lana Tucker, Andrew Pappas, County Auditor candidate Nancy Eicholtz, GOP Chair for Highland County Paulette Donnelly, and many of my campaign chairs, Lee Redkey, Brad Bigler, Mike Inker, Mark Falk, and Barbara Hall. So thank you all for being here. It's truly appreciated. Look, it's kind of interesting. In 1997, there was a lot of debate about congressional term limits. And there was an individual in Congress who stood up and said, voters support term limits because they want to get rid of people who've been here for 20 or 30 years. That was an individual in Congress who actually supported term limits at that time, who believed that we needed to make sure that we had term limits. That individual was Sherrod Brown. And what's interesting is that today we have someone who now wants to run for almost 30 years in Washington. Let's face it, term limits are supported by so many people, whether that's Republicans, Democrats, Independents. There are a number of polls out there that show overwhelmingly more than 75% of Americans support term limits, and I think it's important. I've said all along Washington is broken. I said the best way to fix Washington is two things, and one of those key things is term limits. We have to make sure that we get term limits established in Washington, because the power base becomes so that people start voting not for their state anymore, but they start voting for their leadership. And we've seen that with our Senator Sherrod Brown, who votes 97% with Chuck Schumer, almost 95+ % with Elizabeth Warren. This is the type of senator we don't need anymore. We need senators who are going to go in, do what's right for their state, and then leave and let others come in. That's what's so important and powerful about term limits. We need to make sure that we can move people through, and that power base that doesn't really represent the state anymore is changed. And that's why I'm a big believer that there are two things that are a necessity. Again, we have to make sure that we bring the power of the individual people back, and that the representatives that represent them go to Washington, get their job done, and then leave, and allow others to continue to serve, and not build the power base up that occurs with term limits. So again, it's interesting that Sherrod Brown also said the people of Ohio, he would term limit himself because he also believes that people in Washington, people here in Ohio, do not want people in Washington for 20 to 30 years. I mean, these are quotes from a politician that today wants you to re-elect him to be there for over 30 years. This is what we have to stop in Washington. So I've personally agreed to sign the pledge with the U.S. Term Limits Congressional Pledge, where I will co-sponsor and be a part and vote for the U.S. Term Limits Amendment of 3 House terms and 2 Senate terms. But I'm also going to personally sign a pledge also in Washington that says that I will serve no more than 2 full terms in the United States Senate.
Congressman is signing the pledge. I'd like to say a few words. My name is Bob Berry. I'm with U.S. Term Limits, and I used to say that it's refreshing whenever someone in office endorses the idea of term limits. And I'm really going to change that, because days like today, I think it's actually just exciting. I think it's exciting when we see someone who has voluntarily taken the pledge. We need a constitutional amendment to make this thing happen. There was a decision in 1995, it was known as the Thornton decision, where the Supreme Court said that states cannot limit the terms of their own federal officials. It's going to require a constitutional amendment, and that's why we came up with this idea of having a pledge. And the congressman has just sign the pledge. I'm going to witness it in a moment. This is a fantastic step forward. It's something we encourage anyone who's running for office at really any level, but especially Congress, to do. The congressman has gone the extra mile by taking a self-pledge, and not just taking a self-pledge, but you're also modeling the pledge, because this is a seat that many people in Congress would just ride out for really indefinitely. And by moving and saying, no, I want to offer more, I think this is really interesting. I think it's something that citizens of Ohio should zero in on. U.S. Term Limits is a nonpartisan organization. We don't endorse candidates, but we are very, very flattered when candidates endorse us, or more accurately, these ideas. And we didn't originate these ideas. These ideas have been around since the founding of the country. The term the founders used, and I think it's a good term, I'd like to bring it back, is rotation in office. And that is essentially what you're seeing modeled here. I really enjoyed the quote that the congressman read a moment ago, and I want to read another quote, and this is from the president. The president said, "We want to see new voices and new ideas emerge. That's part of the reason why I think term limits are a really useful thing." Then there was an additional quote. "I think politics suffers when you have the same people staying in power over and over and over again for many years, and there's never any new blood or new ideas. They get more and more entrenched. If you're in power for too long, even with the best of intentions, you become stale and your government becomes stale. Over time, you will not do what's best for the country, and the country will suffer. I see sometimes in the U.S. Congress people who have been there for 20, 30, and 40 years. Because they're still there, they're blocking the 25 or 30 or 35-year-old who is more of their time and could be more innovative and creative in solving problems we face today." That is a quote from the president. That is a quote from President Barack Obama. I should also say that President Trump endorses this idea and has made his own statement, but I thought this particular quote was very appropriate given what we're doing today. This is an issue that enjoys the support of at least 80% of the American public, no matter how we ask the question. We get this level of support. This is not a Republican idea. This is not a Democrat idea. This is an American idea, and we're delighted to be able to share in this moment with the congressman. I want to thank him for signing this pledge to support a constitutional amendment, but I also want to thank him for taking the self-pledge, which we didn't ask him to do. Thank you so much, Congressman.
At this time, I would take any questions from the press that might have any.
One of the topics of the day, obviously, is the president's selection to the U.S. Supreme Court. What are your thoughts on the potential incoming justice?
Well, look, I think he's a thoughtful jurist, no doubt. He also respects the Constitution, which I think is important, and he also has the experience of being on the bench and has really written a number of decisions which have been approved by the Supreme Court. So I think we have an individual that's been selected who has the background and experience and also the respect for the Constitution which is needed. So I fully support the choice.
Some people perceive a problem in this country, and I ask you, what would you say would be an acceptable percentage of Muslims into the country?
Well, look, the country is, the United States is a country that we just need to make sure we protect our borders. I'm a big believer in all the things that we talk about, the wall. I'm a big believer in making sure we have legal immigration. And I think in the end, that's the key, making sure we have legal immigration and we support legal immigration.
Any other questions from the media?
What do you think Representative Jim Jordan should do with the allegations that he ignored sexual misconduct at OSU?
Well, first off, I know Jim Jordan. I know him as he's a great man and a good man. And I think what we really need to do is let's let the facts come out and see where we end up. Too many people like to try and judge people long before all the facts are out. So let's see what the facts are. But the Jim Jordan I know is a solid guy and a good guy.
What's your take on gerrymandering?
Well, look, I've said all along that we need to make sure that elected officials are the ones who are making the decisions. They're the ones elected by the people. But I also think that we need to make sure that they're fair and reasonable, and that our districts really represent the people.
Are they currently fair and reasonable in Ohio?
Well, they're fair and reasonable under the rules and the laws in the state of Ohio. And that's the issue that I've said all along. If we're going to change the rules and the laws in the state of Ohio, that's one thing. And we should look at it from that standpoint.
So when this issue comes bubbling to the Supreme Court, the fact that the procedure is more important than the result, which the result being essentially very heavily weighted districts for the party in power?
Well, look, I've said all along that it's going to be determined by those that have the power and the elected officials to do that. If we need to change that, we should change that, but that should be a decision
Well,
of
that's the
people.
question. Do we need to change that? Do you think we need to change that, or are you okay with it?
Well, for me, I've said this all along, I'm in a swing district, so I have to represent an entire district of people on both sides of the aisle, and I'm always willing to do that, and I think everyone should be willing to do that. So if that's the way decisions that are made, and if I was staying in the 16th district, which I'm not, I'm now running for Senate, I still like the idea of having diverse districts, because it gives you the ability to talk to everyone and understand their issues and problems. But again, I'm a big believer in the rule of law, and we need to be able to follow that, and I would support whatever decision comes out of the legislature, or the people, if it's a constitutional amendment.
Just to ask you a question about the term limits that we're here for. Your statement was that people are in power for a long time and they let the power get to their head. Is that maybe more the issue than someone being in Congress for a long time? What if someone is doing good and they don't let this power get to their head? We're going to lose someone that is watching over our state that's doing a great job because now they are limited out. I mean,
Well, look, I've learned one thing in 7 years. When I first came out, I used to say that we have term limits every 2 years in Congress and every 6 years in the Senate. But now what I've learned after being there is the power that we end up in Washington ends up in people supporting leadership more than the people back home. I've seen it, I've witnessed it. It's one of the reasons why now I am a proponent of term limits, because I've seen what happens when you go to Washington, and I now understand the issue. When people get there, they want to stay there. Career politicians make their decisions based on the next election, not on the next generation. I'm going to tell you, that's the issue. If you want to get tired of what's going on in Washington, make our politicians start looking to the future instead of the next election.
Congressman, is there any value, though, to institutional knowledge of a person who has been there for more than 6 years or more than 12 years?
Ask the people in this country, because more than 75% of them say no because they support term limits. I mean, it's amazing. The institutional value is broken, and that's why we have stalemates in Congress. That's why we're passing bills out of the House that go to the Senate and just sit there. It's for me, it's a broken system that needs to be changed with fresh ideas. I went to Washington willing to work with both sides. I'm going to continue to be willing to work with both sides. I think that's important. But at the end, I went to Washington to get something done and get out. That's what people need to do. People need to realize that that's the key. Too often people are going to Washington, they like the power, and they want to stay there. I actually went to Washington to get a couple things accomplished. I was frustrated, my dealership was taken from me, and I thought Washington had overreached in their power, and I wanted to change that. What I found is that the power base is built on politicians who worry about nothing but the next election, and they turn around and continue to always vote for the next election and decisions on the next election. What's interesting about Sherrod Brown is he shows up every 5 years now. That's amazing, but he knows this is election time, and his decisions are based on elections. I want decisions to be made on getting in, getting out, and doing the right thing.
How do you respond to people that argue that term limits just give more power to the lobbyists and staffers who will be there longer than the members of Congress and writing a lot of the legislation?
Well, look, I see it as different. I'm a business guy. When I went in, it's about my office and the people I represent. And you talk to any of my staffers in Washington, they'll know. I'll say, hey, that's not the direction we're taking. We're going to take the direction what's best for my district and the state of Ohio and the country in the future. So I think if you elect good representatives, they're going to do what's best for the people they represent.